Thank you. Well, thank you, everyone, for being here, for joining us both in person and remotely from different parts of the world. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's a moment to reflect and to celebrate the fact that we're paying attention to one of the most important challenges facing us as a global community. One of the most important challenges, yet one of the issues that is often neglected, to be honest, in climate negotiations and public policies, especially in the global north, in countries like the US and Western Europe and beyond. So I'm asking a simple question. Are we prepared for mass climate migration? And the reason I ask this question is because there's a number of recent studies from very conservative institutions, not the climate institutions or the pro-climate action kind of NGOs. I'm talking about the World Bank. I'm talking about the IMF. I'm talking about historically very conservative institutions when it comes to economic policy. They're quietly panicking about what the data is showing about climate change. I'm talking about Wall Street investment banks who are quietly panicking about the economic impact, the financial instability, and the displacement of people that will be induced by climate change. And we're not talking about 100 years from now or more. We're talking about 2030 and beyond. 2030 in terms of climate timeframe, that's the day after tomorrow, which means, are we acting today to prepare for this mass migration that will inevitably accelerate? Because it's already happening. It's not something new that will emerge. It has emerged, as I will show from the data here. So let's start with some basic points. Let's see if I'm able to do this. So first, with some basic definitions, you hear a lot of references to environmental refugees or climate refugees. So climate refugees are a subset of environmental refugees. Environmental refugees are people who are forced to move because of natural disasters like volcanic eruptions or things of that, or earthquakes or things of that nature. Climate refugees are people who are specifically displaced because of climate change and because of global warming. Here we're talking about increasingly more intense climate events that create massive floods, like what we've seen recently in Pakistan, or what countries like Bangladesh have experienced, sea level rises, or what we here in the United States, in the state of Louisiana, are increasingly experiencing on a regular basis, displacement of people because of climate-induced events. That's what we're referring to as climate refugees or climate migrants. Now, international institutions are very careful with the language they use because of the commitment and the policy implications of the use of the phrase climate refugee, because refugees are protected by the UN and there are funds dedicated to supporting them. But climate refugees, and they have rights, right, including rights to housing, rights to food, rights to work, rights to be placed as legal residents in neighboring nations and so on. It doesn't mean that they always get the rights or get the funding, but there are rights that are implied. And if we officially create this new designation, which we must at some point soon, then there's going to be all kinds of repercussions in terms of how we identify climate refugees and how do we give them the rights that they deserve. In 2009, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees reported that year, in 2009, there was 36 million people were displaced by natural disasters. And most scientists, since then, there's increasingly more studies and forecasts and reports, they're looking at this number moving to 50 million at least, and as high as 200 million by 2050. So that's what we're dealing with. the root causes of climate change. Increasingly, the evidence is very clear from the IPCC report, from the last IPCC 6th assessment report. It's very clear that we're on track towards missing essentially the 1.5 degree limit that we set for ourselves by the end of the century, and possibly also missing even the 2 degree global warming limit that we set for ourselves. And this is from the production gap report, which was produced a couple of years ago by the United Nations Environmental Program, and essentially looked at a very simple piece of data. We're looking at how much we as a global community are planning to extract and burn by 2030, by 2040, by 2050. And then looking at how much we're actually allowed to extract and burn if we're going to meet the climate challenge by 2030, by 2040. And right now we're on track essentially to extract and burn twice as much as we're allowed by 2030, and also on track to extract and burn almost 4 times as much by 2040. In other words, instead of slowing down and turning the direction in the right direction, we're actually stepping on the accelerator and moving faster towards the cliff. So this is what the data is telling us. And these are not forecasts. These are plans for actual extraction and use of fossil fuels by the top producing nations, by the top oil and gas companies. In other words, what we must do immediately is number one, phase out. Number one, stop adding additional production capacity of fossil fuels. And number two, accelerate the phasing out of existing fossil fuel infrastructure. If we're going to meet the challenge of keeping global warming below the 2 degree limit and hopefully below the 1.5 limit by the end of the century, because that should be our ultimate goal. The science is very clear. Exceeding those limits is going to set in motion irreversible climate effects that will be devastating for hundreds of millions of people. And today I'm just zooming in on a particular aspect of these devastating impacts, and it's the question of climate migration. So, the water issue. We've seen water conflicts over the last several decades, over centuries, and these water stress situations are very clearly accelerating. This is a map of water stress. It's a few years out of date, but the picture is very clear. There will be hotspots around the world where water will increasingly become a source of economic devastation, a source of social and political instability, and a source of mass movement of people. The World Bank, again, not the most progressive institution on the planet when it comes to economic issues, when it comes to overstating, the need for intervention. It started producing this report called Groundswell, and I think they will produce it now on a regular basis. This is from the latest report. 216 million people are estimated to be displaced. These are internal migrants in different parts of the world. You can see the numbers there for Africa, for South America, for Asia, and so on. This is under the scenario of no significant change in our policies. And they do run a couple of other scenarios, which I'll show you in a minute. But this is what we're talking about. So if we do nothing and continue on this path, do we have the infrastructure, the schools, the housing, the food, the logistical networks, the hospitals, the healthcare system to actually welcome with dignity 216 million people who are displaced because they lost their livelihood, because they lost their land, because they lost their communities? Are we prepared for this? And I would argue we're not. And if we introduce transformative policies to slow down the impact of climate change, it's not like the numbers will disappear. the numbers will be in the 50 to 60 million people, right? So we have to handle this immediately if we're going to treat people with dignity and mitigate the devastating effects. So zooming in a little bit on this study that the World Bank is conducting, they look at three scenarios. The pessimistic scenario that I just presented, the 216 million people, a more inclusive development scenario, and a third scenario that's more climate friendly. And you can see the difference here in terms of the numbers and the regions affected. So zooming in these 6 regions that the World Bank looks at a little bit more carefully, you can see that the African continent is the place where most of the climate events will lead to displacements of people. The upsetting thing in this whole thing is that Africa as a continent is responsible for less than 4% of global emissions. So the people who have not contributed to climate change and its devastating impact are on the front lines and will be the people that will face most displacement because of climate change. There's something fundamentally wrong with this picture and something fundamentally unjust about where we're heading. And as a result, this becomes a question of not climate change, not migration. This is a fundamental question of justice, right? And when we talk about doing something wrong that hurts millions of people, we have to repair the damage. So I'm leading into a discussion about reparations, climate reparations in particular. Zooming in on this picture that the World Bank did for North Africa in particular, just to clarify here, these are projected numbers. This is the map here is for 2030. The colors that are in blue, these are references to people who will be migrating out of those regions. So the blue are migrating out of the blue regions and into the sort of burgundy region or red region. And the intensity of the color reflects how much confidence, the level of certainty we have about these forecasts. So the darker the color, the more certain that those populations will be moving by 2030. Again, 2030 is the day after tomorrow. We're not talking about maybe in 100 years. These are things that are already in motion, right? And as they move to these areas, mostly urban areas, it intensifies the level of unemployment. It intensifies the pressure on housing, on schools, on foods, on transportation. And these things trigger lots and lots of tensions that can be social and political and can be destabilizing. Just as a point of reference, the Syrian conflict, if we go back and pay attention to the series of events that led to the Syrian conflict, it was a massive drought that preceded the Syrian conflict that led to mass migration of about 1.5 million people moving to urban areas because they lost 85% of their livestock. They lost their land. There was no livelihood left for 1.5 million Syrians. This is 3 or 4 years before the Arab Spring, before anything happened in Tunisia and Libya and anywhere else in the region. So that pressure on housing, on food, on jobs, on all of that social tension, I'm not saying is what started the Arab Spring, but it was the ripe environment for a social, political conflict to emerge. So we're not saying that climate change and movements of people will automatically start conflicts, but it will fuel pre-existing political, social tensions and will lead to conflicts, unfortunately. This is 2030. I'm going to click now and show you the 2050 picture. So going back, 2030, not so intense. 2050, everything gets darker and everything gets a little bit more intense. So these things will accelerate across the world. And I just zoomed in here on North Africa. This is my, I'm a native of Tunisia, and I'm very familiar with what migration means for people in the Mediterranean. As we speak, this year, thousands of people perished on the coast of Tunisia and Algeria trying to cross the Mediterranean, including infants, children, whole families, gambling their life away in this very dangerous journey to cross the Mediterranean. So it's already happening, and it will simply intensify. Are we ready for this? Do we have the economic wherewithal to handle this massive transformation that must take place? I argue we're not, and here's why. Here's global income distribution. Inequality is a big component of the structural deficiencies that we have in our system. And this is one of the things that must be adjusted and repaired. Not because of income alone, but because it reflects this next picture, which is the CO2 emissions. It almost maps out perfectly with the income distribution. We have a massive inequality in terms of who's emitting and who's causing these problems. And we have to address this head on. But here's the killer. It's this picture. And I'll simplify it for you because it's a complicated picture to read. Think about it this way. Divide the world into two groups, rich countries and poor countries. I call them the global south and the global north. And then let's net out all global financial transactions, exports, imports, foreign direct investment, remittances, interest payments, debt cancellation, charity transfers, all the transactions. We net the full amount. And what that picture is showing is that in around 2013, right there, $2 trillion moved from the poorest countries to the richest countries. I'll say it again, $2 trillion moved from the global south to the global north, right? So we have a massive sort of suction system, vacuum cleaning system that sucks resources from the global south to the global north, right? So that's the global financial architecture that we have. It's designed to continue the colonial extraction of resources from the global south. And it still exists to this day. And it's actually getting worse. When I started looking at this 20 years ago, it was 500 billion, and then $1 trillion, and now it's 2 trillion. And if we do nothing, in 5 years, in 10 years, I'll be reporting maybe $5-6 trillion worth of extraction. So we need to undo these mechanisms. If we're going to be successful at dealing with climate change, poverty, climate migration, we have to fix the economic foundation. That is fundamental. So we have to repair this problem. That's why I use the term reparations, and I'll get to what it means. But here's where it gets worse. About 10 years ago, the world decided climate change is a problem. And the world decided we're going to set up a green climate fund, set up in South Korea and Seoul. And we're going to commit to putting $100 billion in it annually. Last time I checked, 2 weeks ago, there was only $10 billion in that green climate fund. So it's as if I'm saying, I promise to give you $100 billion to help you with this problem. But then I say, you know, there's COVID crisis and economic problems. I can only give you 10. But what I haven't told you is that I'm taking from you 2 trillion every year. There's something fundamentally wrong with this picture. And if we don't fix it, we're not going to be able to deal with climate change or poverty or the millions of people who will be displaced unjustly because of climate change. So this is the puzzle that we have to address head on. So are countries prepared to accommodate mass climate migration? I don't think so. Do we have the fiscal capacity to pay for it without causing inflation, without bankrupting countries? I argue, and I would like to invite you to consider a policy framework that actually shows we can. If we commit to it, the economics is there. We can afford it, but we have to commit and take action immediately. And this is what I'll show you here. So the level of spending, fiscal spending, that every country can commit is determined by what I call the degree of monetary sovereignty. How much spending capacity each country has before it starts causing inflation and bankrupting itself. Not all countries have, no country has unlimited spending capacity. We all have some spending capacity before we get into the danger zone of inflation and hyperinflation and bankrupting the country. And what I'm showing you here on this spectrum of monetary sovereignty is that some countries have a very high degree of monetary sovereignty, like the US, like Japan, like Canada. So those countries have the capacity to spend more. And then we have countries, mostly in the global south, who have very limited to no spending capacity. Their degree of monetary sovereignty is very limited, and I would argue has been destroyed over time with colonialism and neocolonial extraction. So on that spectrum, my goal is to help countries that have very limited spending capacity acquire more spending capacity with strategic policies, and help countries who already have large degree or high degree of monetary sovereignty to introduce policies that help them actually increase it even more, so we can tackle these global challenges without causing inflation, without bankrupting anybody. But reparations has to be part of the story, repairing the damage, including transfer of financial resources to countries that have limited spending capacity, transfer of technology, transfer of know-how, but fundamentally transforming that global suction system that takes $2 trillion from the poorest countries, right? So reforming the global economic architecture, as opposed to leaving it intact and saying, oh, here's a little bit of transfer to help you transition to renewable energy. Well, I haven't changed the structure. It's as if I have a bucket and I'm saying I'm going to put more money in it, more water in it to help you, refuel, but the bucket is leaking and I'm taking the money back out with that suction system, right? So we have to fundamentally change the structure. So here's how most economists, most policymakers think about how much spending we can put in place on climate, on justice, on health, on infrastructure. Most economists will tell you, well, governments will tax, and they use the tax revenues to pay for government programs. They can certainly borrow from financial markets, borrow from financial institutions domestically or internationally, borrow from the IMF, from the World Bank, from all kinds of the African Development Bank and so on. But then they say, well, that's it, right? You have to be fiscally disciplined by how much you can raise in tax revenues and how much markets will allow you to borrow. What I'm arguing here is that countries actually have this additional spending capacity that remains untapped. It's not infinite. I'm not saying that government should just print money and spend. Absolutely not. I'm saying there is a little bit more space. And it's not infinite, it's determined or limited by the risk of inflation. So then I become obsessed with the risk of inflation. What actually causes inflation? And how can we take that risk of inflation, that red bar, and how can we push it out and actually create a little bit more space to deal with climate change, to deal with poverty, to deal with all the issues that we deal with? So to me, the risk of inflation comes from two places. The first one is what we call the lack of productive capacity. If you ran out of machinery, equipment, skilled workers, logistics, and we spend more to increase demand, then it will cause inflation. The good news about productive capacity is that it's producible. We can actually create millions of jobs to build more productive capacity And if we do that, we push the risk of inflation further out and we create more spending capacity. That's the good news. So it takes strategic planning and strategic investments in key areas where we actually lack productive capacity. In the global south, this will be renewable energy to bring electricity to 600 million Africans today who don't have access to electricity. That's increasing productive capacity. Investing in food sovereignty to bring domestic local food production that's insulated price-wise from the risk of price increases because of a conflict in the Ukraine or because of a COVID shutdown of global shipments and things like that, right? That's how you build resilience to these external inflation shocks, right? Is by investing in food sovereignty. But here's the second source of inflation, is what I call abusive price setting behavior by key players in the economy, multinational corporations, dominant producers who can raise prices simply because they can or because we let them, because there's no competition. That kind of inflation risk, we can eliminate it by taxing and regulating their abusive market power, by introducing antitrust laws, enforcing existing antitrust laws, right? By democratizing the market, making it more competitive. And if we successfully do both, 1 and 2, increase productive capacity in strategic areas and democratize the market, make it more competitive, then essentially that bright yellow space all of a sudden gets larger because we're pushing the risk of inflation further and further away. So this is the framework that a country like the US can use to increase its fiscal spending capacity even more to afford, say, a Green New Deal in the US and climate reparations to countries in the global south, transfer of resources, technology, and so on. But countries in the global south who have very limited fiscal policy space, that bright yellow space is very small for most developing countries. How can we increase it? It's by investing in food sovereignty, investing in energy sovereignty, investing in strategic productive capacity that will allow that bright yellow space to broaden and widen in the global south so we can actually mitigate the negative impacts of climate change and all of that. So dealing with climate migration is not going to happen if the economics doesn't add up. And right now, the economics doesn't add up because we haven't done the hard work of actually preparing economic structures for the oncoming mass migration and negative effects of climate change. But we do have the tools to figure out exactly what needs to be done. We need the leadership, political leadership on a global scale to start the hard work. And that's what I'm suggesting today. It's a paradigm shift. Most governments are not thinking in this way. They're thinking there's too much inflation and it's because we already spend too much. And they're thinking we should introduce austerity policies, reduce spending. And that's what's causing the status quo to remain. And that's what's going to cost us even more in the long term in terms of intervention and negative consequences. So I'll highlight key weaknesses, especially in the global south, that must be addressed. Most countries in the global south have structural trade deficits. High external debt emerges out of that structural trade deficit. And when you dig in and look at the root causes, we identify 3 major sources. Most countries in the global south import their energy. And here I include even the biggest oil producers in Africa, like Nigeria. Nigeria is a massive producer of oil and gas, but imports all of its gasoline, right? Why? Because there's no refining capacity. Who controls the refining capacity? The global north. It's not by accident, it's by design. So you end up essentially exporting low value added content, the raw material, and importing the higher value added content, more refined petrochemicals, gasoline and kerosene and so on. And you do this across the board, not just in oil, but in manufacturing, We import capital, we import machinery, the inputs, the intermediate goods, the technology, the know-how, and then we use low-cost labor for exports. So high value added content of what you import, low value added content of what you export. You are never getting out of that trap, right? So we have a structural trap related to the value added of what we produce and what we import. We have food deficits because most countries in the global south were forced into losing their food sovereignty after becoming independent via mass subsidies in the global north. Europe introduced a common agricultural policy, which was designed to turn the African continent into a net importer of food. Today, Africa, the most fertile land on the planet, imports 85% of its food, not by accident. And it's getting worse because of climate change and droughts, but it's by design, right? And then energy deficits, as I mentioned, even the biggest producers of energy. And we must transition to renewable energy, but we must transition to renewable energy by getting out of these traps. So you take these three structural weaknesses and they produce an annual trade deficit. That trade deficit causes your currency, the value of your currency, to weaken relative to the dollar, relative to the euro. And with the weaker currency, everything you buy the next morning is going to be more expensive. So you literally import inflation. And now, if inflation hits food and fuel and medicine, you have riots. So you must intervene as a government to protect the most vulnerable, for social stability, for political stability, and you artificially fix your exchange rate to the dollar or to the euro or to stronger currencies. But to do that, you must borrow dollars and euros to stabilize your exchange rate. And here's the debt trap. The external debt trap starts. And there's no getting out of that debt trap as long as you have energy deficits, food deficits, and as long as your manufacturing is always deficient, because you specialize in extractive industries or just low value added assembly line manufacturing. That is the transformation needed so that those $2 trillion that I mentioned earlier, that number starts to go down and hopefully reverse. So we can actually increase the spending capacity of countries in the global south. That's not going to happen via market forces. This is damage that was done and needs to be repaired with actual policies that target these fundamental weaknesses. I'm going to skip ahead here because I already mentioned what I said. Here's the problem, and I'll try to highlight it very quickly. The mainstream economic model that countries in the global south are often advised to follow. They say, oh, you have a lot of external debt. Here's what you need to do. Austerity, tighten your belts. The government is too wasteful, so spend less. Debt restructuring, not debt cancellation. We'll restructure. We'll just let you pay on easier terms in the long term because you're borrowing every year. I mean, Tunisia, my own country, is going through a debt crisis right now. Tunisia finally managed to negotiate a $1.9 billion loan from the IMF over the next 4 years, paid in installments. So the IMF is going to give Tunisia $1.9 billion in installments over the next 4 years. And then I look up how much does Tunisia owe the IMF from old loans and how much are we scheduled to pay in the next 4 years. It turned out to be exactly $1.9 billion. Where is the help? It's not help. It's the IMF helping itself, giving Tunisia a loan so that Tunisia can pay its old loans on time. No getting out of that trap. And they imposed on Tunisia and other countries in the global south, privatize state-owned enterprises, sell them to the highest bidders, right? Water, electricity, infrastructure, roads, highways, everything for sale, airlines. Well, it brings in a little bit of cash, but as long as you're stuck in that trap, you're going to need more cash in a few years. So once you sell the airport, you can't sell it again in 3 years. That's it. The cash is gone. Labor market flexibility. This is econ code word for crack down on labor unions, lower wages, lower labor standards, right? Make it more flexible to attract investors to come and extract more value from your economy, from your workers. Foreign direct investment and export-led growth. Well, foreign direct investment, first let's start with export-led growth. We support a lot of promotion of exports from developing countries. What kind of exports? The kind I was talking about. You import the capital, the machinery, you subsidize workers' livelihood, food subsidies, fuel subsidies, in order to assemble inputs that you bought from the global north, and you export low value added content. That's export-oriented industries. Every country that pursued export-led growth, they ended up with bigger trade deficits because they import more than what they export, right? And it's subsidized. The government has to subsidize electricity production for manufacturing because we have energy deficits. We subsidize workers so that low-wage workers in the export industries can actually afford to eat, right? Otherwise, they can't work. It's all subsidized too. FDI is even worse. Foreign direct investors who come in and run those manufacturing units. Again, low value added manufacturing assembly line, but it's even worse because the profits that they generate are repatriated to the global north. They're not even reinvested in the country. So these are strategies that we're told are solutions. Well, they're kind of solutions because they create a lot of jobs and they give the illusion of industrialization. We see these large industrial zones and trucks going back and forth and ships coming and going, lots of economic activity, but the net effect is getting you deeper into that trap. I'm not saying we should stop all foreign direct investment or exports. I'm talking about the composition of what we produce, the technology that we use, right? That's the long-term trap that we're in. Financial liberalization. They say, well, set up a mini Wall Street, attract foreign investors left and right. Well, if you have a weak economy, the only people you're attracting via artificial manipulation of interest rates and exchange rate are speculators, right? We've seen this in South Africa, we've seen this in Mexico, all developing countries in the last 20, 30 years that try to set up a mini financial market to compete with Wall Street. They ended up attracting speculators. And speculators, they buy low and sell high, and they will leave the country at the earliest moment when they think they've gotten what they wanted, which is buy low and sell high, and then leave the country dealing with the devastating market crash and currency crisis and so on. Tourism. A lot of people think, well, tourism is the solution. Millions of people come with dollars and euros and create jobs in hotels and restaurants. Well, here's the thing. You bring 10 million tourists to the country, you have to feed them. So you import even more food, which you don't have. You have to heat and cool the hotels. You have to transport them. You have to import even more energy, which you don't have. You have to buy fancy equipment for hotels and entertainment and nightclubs and all of that, which you don't have. So it adds to your trade deficit. And you're racing to the bottom because you're competing with 100+ other beautiful countries, beautiful people, great food, racing to the bottom to offer the lowest hotel deals, the lowest cost of service to attract tourists. So we're all racing to the bottom with this tourism. Now, if you had food sovereignty and energy sovereignty, tourism would be a net benefit. But we don't have that in the global south, right? So it ends up being a trap, right? But it looks like a solution because you see millions of tourists and you see hundreds of thousands of people working in the tourism-related industry, which is good. But overall, long-term, it's getting you deeper into that trap. Remittances, right? We send people to the global north to minimize unemployment at home, and they send cash to their families. Now, that's not a development policy. Take the doctors, the nurses, the engineers, and ship them abroad as a free gift to the global north, right? After 2 or 3 decades worth of investment in education and public health to produce the best and the brightest, and then send them as a gift to the global north. Not a model for economic development. So we end up with this collective race to the bottom, more external debt, and we're told there is no alternative. And what I'm suggesting here, this is the trap that we need to get out of. And it's like, if you're stuck in a deep hole, the first thing you do is you stop digging and figure out a way to come out. And what we're told by the mainstream model, you should dig faster, harder, without corruption, right? Dig faster and harder without corruption, with transparency, with integrity, but dig harder, right? We're not saying corruption is good. Corruption is bad, but I'm trying to get you to pay attention to the fact that we're digging deeper, not coming out, right? With or without corruption, with or without transparency, with or without democracy, we're digging ourselves deeper into these traps. And if we're going to deal with climate migration and all of the issues that we're gathered here today to discuss, we need to stop digging and figure out a different way to come out of these economic traps. So just one example, I just picked Ghana, but I could have picked any of the global South countries. This is Ghana's exports by composition. Look at the big blocks, mostly raw materials exports, tourism, things like that. Look at Ghana's imports. The composition is much more what we call complex products, high-tech, high value-added products. And this is typical, country after country. Just, you can eyeball it. This is the trap, right? There's something structural about each one of these economies that keeps us in this external debt trap. So back to the spectrum of monetary sovereignty, a quick summary. The global South, on the weaker end of the spectrum, low degree of fiscal spending, high levels of external debt, not responsible for climate change, by the way, high levels of external debt, low productive capacity, low capacity for research and development to develop the technologies, and it suffers from this neo-colonial external, extraction of wealth that we've designed. On the other hand, the global North has a high degree of monetary sovereignty, so it can spend more, is responsible for climate change, has low or no external debt to speak of, talking about the richest countries here, high productive capacity, high research and development capacity, and benefits from this neo-colonial extractive system. That's why we need to repair this system. So reparations, and when we talk about reparations, it's not just a transfer of cash payments. No, we're talking about cash payments, debt cancellation, and actually repairing the system so that it doesn't suck $2 trillion a year. So repairing the fact that the global South has faced a situation where its food sovereignty has been destroyed, its energy sovereignty has been destroyed, and its industrial system has been set up in an extractive way by design. That's the part that needs to be repaired, and it involves cash payments, debt cancellation, transfer of technology, transfer of know-how, and it's reparations for climate damage, reparations for colonial atrocities, reparations for this neo-colonial transfer of resources from the South to the North. And the list goes on. We can talk about reparations for biopiracy, theft of indigenous knowledge from the global South by pharmaceutical companies, for example. We can talk about reparations for cultural heritage appropriation. The long list is there, right? But something fundamental needs to be restructured so we can have a completely different financial architecture, economic architecture, so we can have the financial resources, the economic wherewithal to actually meet the challenge of climate change and address the pressing issue of climate migration so we can treat people with dignity, with justice. And I'll skip this last part because people usually ask me, well, how will developing countries really transform their industries? I'll say it in 2 sentences here. You need a South-South strategic partnership for industrial policy. I'll give you one quick example, and I think everybody's going to understand it. If you look at the African continent as a block, all the natural resources for the renewable energy revolution that everybody's talking about are available. You have the human resources, the natural resources, then you have 600 million people who don't have electricity. Why not design a Pan-African industrial policy to use the human capabilities and the natural resources to build industries to serve the needs of the continent of energy sovereignty? Now you might say, well, the technology doesn't exist on the continent. Well, this is where partnership with other countries, partnerships on equal terms, not extractive terms. And it may be partnership with technology with Germany, with the United States, with Japan, with China. It doesn't matter which source of technology you use, as long as it's designed and done to serve the needs of the continent. And here I remind everybody of Mia Mottley's famous line, the Prime Minister of Barbados. She said, friends of all, satellites of none, in terms of geopolitical strategy for small developing countries. We're not satellites of other countries. Friends of all, satellites of none. And if that means economic diplomacy to get the technological partnership needed to provide electricity for 600 million people in Africa and transition to a just and sustainable and equitable society, and if that technology comes from China, so be it. If it comes from Germany, so be it. It doesn't matter as long as we deliver what needs to be delivered. So I'll close with a few concluding remarks here. We have 10 years to go, really not more than that in terms of transformative action. The climate crisis, inequality, poverty, exclusion, and injustice call for urgent and bold actions, not small and incremental, policies. The current climate and jobs policies are too weak, too slow, expensive, ineffective, and actually dangerous. Preparing countries for mass climate migration requires a fundamental restructuring of the global economic architecture. And this is why I think, and I urge you to consider, that a global Green New Deal type of framework with climate and colonial reparations is possible, desirable, and affordable. Thank you. I'm happy to take questions from the audience here or also online, possibly. Yeah. Yes, please. Yeah, if you use the microphone right there so we can hear you. Yes, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Dr. Fadhel Kaboub, for that wonderful presentation. I never crossed my mind that this particular issue you have discussed with us can generate much more migration issue, as we have just discussed it in a very simplistic way for those of us who are not experts like you are. My name is Abdurrahman Baruko from Nigeria. I just want to ask two questions. You keep on saying if you don't fix it now, then there will be repercussion for it.
Yes.
When you say we, if you don't fix it, who specifically are you referring to? Is it the government of these affected nations or wherever? Two, you made mention of reparation, and in your concluding remarks, you also said reparation. Who is demanding for this reparation, and who is paying the reparation? That's the second one. The third one, and most alarming, yesterday, you were told about the migration of people from Africa, about less than 20 million. But you are telling us that if you don't take care of this thing, we might likely have over 200 million globally.
Yeah.
Oh, that's alarming. So I don't know if you want to talk on this because, like I said, I'm from Nigeria. As at last week that I left, we have 36 states plus FCT. Out of these 36 states, 33 states were affected by flood. And then people are dislocated, and I mean, people are just confused, they don't know where to go to.
Yep.
So I was just thinking, imagine this thing just happened to 3 or 4 countries, and Nigeria is over 200 million people.
Right.
So where do we go to? So thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your questions.
Yeah.
I'll start with the last question.
Okay.
That is why we're here. That is why we're raising this question, because we as a global community, especially countries in the global north. I mean, when the Syrian refugee crisis happened almost a decade ago, we're talking about less than 5 million people moving. The world panicked, right? Europe closed its borders. The US limited, like severely limited, how many of those refugees were allowed to come into the US. That tells us how unprepared we are.
Yeah.
Not that I'm not trying to diminish what happened in Syria and the Syrian people, but imagine multiple countries facing multiple crises. Not all of these estimates are saying that these will be people moving in addition to a conflict happening, but the likelihood of conflicts will increase. So unfortunately, we're not ready, right? Even if we welcome climate migrants in Europe, in North America, in Australia, do we actually have the physical capacity of housing, of schools, of hospitals, of everything needed to actually welcome millions of people? And we don't, because we already neglect people who are already here, right? So we're not delivering justice and fairness and equity, let alone when the additional pressures mount. And that's when people panic and close borders. And that's when millions of people die in the Mediterranean and other parts of the world, or are literally forced to remain where they are. And that's where tensions tend to rise. So that is the sad truth. Now, the question about reparations, who's going to pay whom? What I suggested here is that the group of countries who have been responsible for climate change, coincidentally, also have the most spending capacity, the financial wherewithal to actually pay and repair the damage, transfer technology, and so on. And the countries who have not caused climate change are the countries who are suffering the consequences of climate change, and are the countries who don't actually have any spending capacity at this point. If anything, they're trapped with external debt. So reparations means transfer from the richest to the poorest, from the most powerful economically to the least powerful, from those who caused the damage historically. We're talking about cumulative historical emissions since the Industrial Revolution, to those who did not emit anything close to their fair share of global, what we call a global climate carbon budget. To me, that seems reasonable, fair, and possible, doable. Now, I'm not naive here. There has to be a political framework for it. And that's why I'm urging all of us as we head into COP27 in a few days in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt, to put the issue of climate finance on the table once and for all, not as loans, not as charity, not as empty promises like the Green Climate Fund, which promised to put 100 billion every year and only has 10 as of last week, right? And without mentioning that, by the way, we're taking 2 trillion from you as we promised to give you 100 and only deliver 10. So we have to be very honest and call them out on this. And when I say we, it's we collectively, but also countries in the global south, leadership in the global south that doesn't recognize these traps that I'm highlighting here. They think that more foreign direct investment from the global north is going to be helpful and is going to provide the financial resources for developing countries to mitigate climate change. And what I'm showing is that it's actually getting you deeper in the trap, right? So first you have to recognize that you're in a trap and then call out the situation and demand reparations. So this is a call for all of us in civil society and governments and the global north and the global south, because we're all in this together. It's not like some countries will survive and others will suffer. Eventually, all of us will face the consequences, right?
Okay, so we have two questions in the chat. One is, what other economical models are there to solve this problem in the free market? And then the other question is about diversity, training, especially, within the migrants kind of community when they travel.
Okay. The first question on what other economic solutions have been put on the table, and I'll mention one that's becoming the favorite, what I call false solution, but the favorite solution of fossil fuel companies and increasingly mainstream economists and policymakers, which is some sort of carbon tax, some sort of cap and trade, market-based solutions, they call them, right? Let the market fix it, right? Because that's gonna help us meet the challenge. So cap and trade, for example, it's the idea of setting a cap, a maximum level of emissions that we're going to allow, and then force those who exceed the emissions quotas, big industrial polluters, for example, to buy the right to pollute from those who have done their work and reduced their emissions and have pollution rights essentially to sell. And that's the market, people trade. Well, the biggest winners of any market system are those who manage the trade, the traders, right? But here's what happened. Those who actually incur the additional cost of buying the right to pollute, they're usually too powerful in the market, and they will pass on the cost to their customers via their abusive market power, right? Now we can say the government can subsidize consumers and all that, but it doesn't change their behavior, right? The other problem is governments set the cap way too high. So in other words, we're not actually forcing the market to do the right thing. Now, in terms of diversity and equity training, this is any kind of mass movement of people, any kind of cultural diversification, which here in this country we've been experiencing obviously for a long time, and we haven't done the best job in welcoming migrant communities. So it just highlights again how much work and how much institutional preparedness by regulators, by universities, by state and local government agencies, civil society, so that we're actually doing what I suggested we should do, which is treat people with dignity, welcome people in new homes. We're talking about whole countries essentially losing their population, small island nations that will sink in the ocean, that will have to be welcomed somewhere else with their language, with their culture, with their religious and spiritual traditions in new communities that have not interacted with them before. How do we treat people with dignity, with food, with housing, with schools, with cultural heritage preservation in a new environment that should become their rightful home?
We have a question online from Professor Dr. Abiyomi Ajebola. You may ask your question, sir.
Yes, please unmute and welcome. We can't hear you.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
I'm audible now. Thank you. Professor.
Unfortunately, unfortunately, the connection is not. Maybe if you could type your question in the chat, because we're not able to hear you. The sound is breaking. Thank you.
Okay.
We'll be able to read your question in the chat.
In the meantime, Ms. Felisa Nkome, Como, you can ask your question if you're able to, or you can also
yes
question in the chat.
No, I am able to speak. Yes,
Welcome.
thank you so much. Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Fadhel, and good afternoon, colleagues. Well, good morning to those who are in New York. I mean, thank you so much for such a succinct presentation. Obviously, I mean, I share 100% of your views. I just wanted to pick your brain on the South-South partnership.
Mm-hmm.
You know, with the Africa Free Trade Agreement, right?
Yep.
And obviously, I'm asking you, with all the constraints associated with the mainstream economic model, and the fact that, I mean, you know, the elite are really punting the free trade agreement as really the alternative, and the agenda of a South partnership has really not really gained ground in terms of the conversation. For example, the point you're making around technology, I do think that Africa could, you know, benefit a lot from South to South partnerships technology. But just want to pick your brain and think that whether free trade agreement, in fact, could lead us into the direction of South-South partnership, or it's just one of those neoliberal, you know, free trade agreements that will not actually build a resilient African economies.
Thank you for your question. It's a very important question. And my observation as an outsider, I'm not involved in the decision-making process, is that the motivation is really for a traditional free trade zone without its strategic industrial policies. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't, you know, dozens of us economists and colleagues all over the African continent who are not in the decision-making process, who are trying to advocate for strategic thinking at the African Union level, so that we're actually not going deeper into a trap of free trade without strategy. I mean, most countries have ministries of trade, ministries of agriculture, but they don't actually have an agricultural policy. They don't have an industrial policy. Our industrial policy, since independence, most countries in the global South, the industrial policy is essentially to do the part of the assembly line, the global assembly line, that the multinational corporations assign for you. That's not a strategy, right? You're just serving somebody else's strategy. And here, if you allow me to make a broader point that's very important for the African continent, for the global South in general. We are currently experiencing a global restructuring of the international economic system after the COVID crisis, and especially after the Ukraine crisis. We're seeing the emergence of basically three major hubs. One in North America, with the dominance of the US and South America essentially attached to it. Another major hub in Western Europe. European leaders are talking about technological sovereignty, food sovereignty, bringing, you know, major manufacturing back to the mainland, so to speak. And then a third major hub in Asia, with the dominance of China, maybe with Central Asia and Russia attached to it for geopolitical reasons. Where is Africa in this new map? Africa is assumed by the three major hubs to remain the source of raw materials, to remain the place for low-cost assembly line, to remain the place for interesting and exotic tourism, and to remain the large consumer market for the surplus produced by the major global hubs. Now, if Africa doesn't have a vision for itself, strategic long-term vision for itself, it's going to be part of somebody else's strategic vision. So that's our call for the African Union, for all the leaders on the continent to recognize that if you're not thinking long-term, your own strategy in a Pan-African way, not in a kind of individual, national, small space, then we're going to remain part of somebody else's vision. And those visions are not going to be helpful for anybody on this planet. Thank you again for your question.
That's all the questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, let's give a round of applause for Dr. Kaboub. We have one question, another? Okay, you want to come up to the mic?
Okay.
So we have one more question. Yes.
Yes, please.
Thank you, Doctor, for this eye-opening lecture.
Thank you.
I've learned so much from what you said. Before I ask my question, I want to give you a little background in a minute or two so you understand where I'm coming from. I happen to start a movement called OIA, which is the French Organisation pour l'Intégration Africaine, which is African Integration Organization. And the reason was that I saw there's a gap between the left, and the leaders in Africa. So I wanted to, bring the gap together so that we can stand as one, not to solve problems in Africa. And along the line, I discovered that some moving from one country to another country, we were having resistance, from the government, because they never understood the importance, of Africa being independent. We're independent, on paper, but in reality, we are not. You understand? So all you've said here, is really true, but I'm talking about solution now.
Mm-hmm.
You see, so many of our leaders who wanted to, bring what they're talking about to fruitfulness, like Gaddafi, like Kaboub of Cote d'Ivoire, most who try to, make sure that we are solving, a continent, they were killed or they were silenced. So my question is, how is it possible for us to emerge, seeing that from what you said too, which is a reality? For example, in Nigeria, we have oil, we don't have a refinery.
Yeah.
And you said, which I know is true, it's not a coincidence. This is something that's created, from the global north. You understand? So how can we get out of this trap? Because we are not the ones determining what's happening. Our presidents are like stooge, manipulated, from the global north. So this is where the problem is.
Mm-hmm.
You understand? Somebody who has good intention for his people. I'll give an example like Babu of Cote d'Ivoire. When he came to power, he discovered that most of the products, cocoa, for example, they take it to France. And cocoa were taken, they produce 100% cocoa, 70% goes to France. They don't pay for it. Babu said, let us do a turn. Let's take 70, take 30. That was the problem. They say, you resign or we kill you. So how do we come out of this problem? Because there are some few leaders in Africa who have good intention for their people, but they won't let them go. So this is a main issue. It's beyond the economic issue. It's political, actually.
Absolutely.
So how do we get out of this talk? Thank you.
Very good question. You're absolutely right. This is not just about the economics. It's about this is a question of power, right? And colonialism of the African continent didn't happen because the continent was poor. It happened specifically because the continent was extremely rich and remains rich, right? So the continuation of what I describe as neo-colonial extraction is precisely because the continent remains rich with resources and people and potential. So it's a question of power, and the most powerful way to control nations was not actually military invasion and colonialism. That was the old way. It's the financial colonialism. It's the debt trap that forces leaders with the best intentions for their people to do the exact opposite because they're broke, right? Because they were forced into selling the airlines and selling the airport and selling the mining rights to pay debts that they have already paid many times over, right? To pay odious debts that should have been canceled decades ago, right? So I'm a teacher, I'm not a politician, or so what I can do is inform, mobilize, empower people with ideas so that we who are actually in civil society, for example, who are fighting for the right issues, we can apply that pressure first on our own leaders and our allies in the global north. And there are many, many allies in civil society and social movements can also be empowered with a counter narrative, with alternative solutions to apply pressure on the policymakers who are in positions of power, who can either maintain the status quo and pretend nothing wrong is happening, it's just stuff happens, or can be forced to act differently. And that's what I'm hoping to do with my little interventions here and there at these events. Thank you for your question. Thank you, everybody. It's been a pleasure, and I'm happy to take questions by email. You have my contact information, or those of you who are here, I'm more than happy to answer questions today. Thank you.